Hello, everyone. My name is Hayden from the San Francisco International Arts Festival, and today I'll be conducting an interview with Natasha Dennerstein. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, you are.
She's a poet that will be performing at the Last Supper party in November, and we just want to do a little artist profile for her before she performs. So, Natasha, I learned that you're from Melbourne, Australia,
I am. I am.
and I know that I'm pretty sure you said somewhere that nature is a big part of what you do in poetry. And I was going to
Well,
ask you,
no. In fact, I've gone on record of saying the only time I'll ever write a nature poem is if it's got a jerry
that's
can of
right.
gasoline in it.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. I saw that.
Uh,
But I was going to ask you, how does being from Australia influence your work? How has it affected your poetry?
I do, Hayden, I do look for the universal in my work. And the first book that I ever wrote, it was published here in San Francisco, actually. Um, it was about the human body. And I deliberately did do that because I, in my mind, like I'd seen these images of human bodies of people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And the idea is that the human remains, skeletons of human beings all look the same. It's even hard to differentiate if it's male or female, except by the hips, the wideness of that um, area. But I just thought, what do all human beings have in common? And it's blood, muscles, bones, under the skin, we're all very similar. So
Mhm.
I could, I deliberately wrote that book. It was called Anatomize, so that as many people as possible could relate to it. Yeah.
Awesome.
So I guess, that's nature,
Mhm.
human nature, the human body. It was very almost medical, like it's divided up into systems. There's the blood and bones system, the um, uh, teeth, hair, skin, and nails, internal organs. It was like that.
Mhm. And has moving to the United States has changed your style at all? Has it influenced anything else?
Um, Not so much style, but perhaps subject matter.
Hmm.
Um, the second book I published here in the Bay Area was called Triptych Caliform, and it was in three segments. One was cinema. One was sort of kink and sort of unusual or different sexualities, lifestyles. And one was really about the Californian kind of experience, the way
Hmm.
people in California eat and conduct their lives and are fascinated by certain things, the Californian lifestyle kind of. So the subject matter of that book was very much Californian. And that was kind of my transitional book, between Australia and here. And I believe that cinema is really, really important. And because, the golden years of cinema was here in California, in Hollywood, between 1925 and 1939, say, I think that that has affected the whole of humankind's brain patterns. And I think that our DNA is altered by cinema, has been altered by cinema, so that we all carry around these cinematic tropes in our
Hmm.
heads. And that it has kind of replaced fairy tales, folk tales, biblical tales. Previous generations, your grandparents and my parents, in the, they were very much influenced by those things. But I think then the next generation was influenced by the cinema, and the one after even more. And then after that,
Yeah.
even more, because of video and availability of watching movies at home, and you know, now there's people born at, say, in the year 2000 who are now age 23. It's my belief they've inherited these cinematic thoughts and ideas and tales and morals. Everyone seems to know the basics of the script.
Yeah.
You know? And the people can, like, even, I don't know, do you think they learn that from watching a whole lot of films, or do you agree with me that it could be inherited? Like it could be in the DNA and the brain?
I definitely, because when, like you said, someone born in 2000 is going to be 23 or 22. I'm 22, so I definitely agree with you that I get my morals and lessons from cinema more often. Because like you said, like obviously my grandfather, who was born in 1930, he learned it from folk tales and, you know,
Yes.
and I was going to ask you a question. Do you think that we lost something during the transfer from like folk tales or mythology to cinema?
No, I think we gained something
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, and you know, maybe, I mean, I think that the older tales from your grandparents and their parents was more inherited orally, but the cinema is very much a visual thing, so it's kind of a little bit lazier. You don't have to use your imagination. Like if you read a book, you know, you have to imagine and use those kind of brain muscles to imagine what it looks like and what the people look like. But in a cinema, it's all spelled out for you.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, it's exercising different parts of the brain, I think.
I see.
Yeah.
My next question would be, nowadays we all know that arts are being defunded in schools and everything, and we're seeing a lot more rise of STEM studies such as like science, mathematics, engineering. And I was just going to ask you, if you were presented with an audience of students, what would you say to them to maintain the importance of, for example, poetry, and like why they should take the time to learn poetry?
I would say to them, poetry is very much akin to songwriting and rap. They're all kind of forms of contemporary poetry. It's storytelling, but there's a format and a form that goes with it. That's very much in the poetic tradition. And you have a platform. You can say the things that you want to say and express the concerns that you want. Look at this young girl, Amanda Gormley. She's fantastic, this slam poet, and she performed at the Biden's inauguration. You know the girl I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd play that to the kids. They may not have seen it on TV. And I'd say, look at this young girl. She's like 15. Listen to what she's saying, you know, and listen to her confidence and her, you know, she's got the biggest platform in the world for her poetry. And, you know, Oprah got her a beautiful yellow coat to wear. And, you know, the eyes of the whole world were on this little girl. Why? Because she's a good poet. That's what, and then we'd talk about that long poem that she read at the Biden inauguration. Did you see it?
I didn't. I don't think I did though.
She was quite good.
Okay, I'll check it out.
I'm sure it's on YouTube.
But yeah, if, like you said, if you look back at like many instances where not only poetry but speech writing and communication, all these like pivotal moments, it all comes down to how well can you write, and obviously poetry is a big part of that and helps people really get to the essence of the message.
Yes, it does. And years ago, I read something by this Ray Bradbury. He's a kind of science fiction writer. he was quite well known, like maybe in the 60s and 70s. He's long dead now. Ray Bradbury is a good writer. I think he wrote Fahrenheit 451. Yeah. And other equally as well-known books. And Ray Bradbury had said, he said, next to my bed, I have a book of essays, and I have a novel, and I have a volume of poetry. And every night I read some pages from each one. And it's because these different forms really exercise a different part of the brain and get you thinking in different ways, but they're all writing. But the essay is a really interesting form because it is a kind of prose poetry. And in a good essay, it starts at a certain point and then it devolves and branches out to different areas. And then it always circles back to the start. So it's a way of thinking and extrapolating, of laying out of ideas, and it has a rhythmic circular motion. And then, but a poem can have that same thing in 13 lines, or not. It can start here and go nowhere, or go to the stars and just keep going. And then a novel is a totally different thing. It's more like a full-length feature film where, there are subplots and there are various characters, but the plot it's a different pace and a different style. Anyhow, I thought, well, Ray Bradbury was a successful writer, so I started doing that and reading essays, because I hadn't been reading. I got the Best American Essays. It comes out every year, and it was actually really good. And I was reading all these essays, and then I've always read novels, and I always read poetry. So I try to, vary my reading because of that. I can't remember what your question was. I think I went off on a tangent.
No, so it's all right. It's totally okay. It was just about the importance of poetry and writing in general.
Yeah, poetry's, it is important. And you can say a lot in a very short space of time with poetry, and you can suggest at things without spelling them out, and you can implant little red herrings in there to make the mind think of other things, but not go there. A poem is like encapsulated. It's like it's akin to a painting, I think, where you've got generally 4 sides and a frame, and it encapsulates a specific moment in time and space in a frozen image. I guess photography is the same, but a poem does that too. Yeah, but in words.
About the importance of poetry, what poets or poems have been a pivotal part of igniting your love for poetry?
The form is short, so you can read a poem in 1 minute, which I kind of like. And I think that it suits the short attention spans of people that have become even shorter because of the internet. People scroll, they read, next, they're not interested to sit down and, take their time. So I think actually poetry is good for people with short attention spans. And I think that you can incorporate rhythm, and you don't have to use traditional form. You can if you want to, and some people still do. There's all these old forms of sonnets and villanelles and pantoums and all these different types of poetry that have sort of fallen out of favor. People don't write poetry that way, and even rhyme. Although, look at really good rap lyrics. They have really good internal rhyme schemes and end rhymes at the end of every line. And, there's more good poetry in rap lyrics sometimes than there is in poetry, which has kind of gone, rhyme and rhythm have gone out of fashion in poetry. It just looks like prose in some cases. I use a bit of that old school stuff, but I won't write a whole sonnet, but I'll have a couplet, with a rhyme at the end of 2 lines that reads like the end of a sonnet. Yeah, and I'll just throw it in there.
Any poets specifically that have inspired you?
Yeah, I like Rita Dove. She's a Black American woman poet. She was the poet laureate of the United States some years ago. And Rita Dove, she's tweaks with genre a little bit. I read this book of poetry of hers, which I just really loved it so much. It was a love story between a man and a woman. And it was a book of poetry, but it was kind of more like a novel because it had a narrative thread through it. Like alternating poems were in the voice of him and her. So it was like a dialogue between two, but it was a series of like 100 poems. And it told a whole love story from, meeting and the trials and tribulations they went through, getting together, all of the whole gamut, a lifetime of love between these two characters. It just blew my mind because I didn't know you could do that with poetry. Yeah. And then there's a British guy that I really, really like called Simon Armitage. He's a really good poet. And what he was doing at the time when I discovered him was he was writing poetry set in women's prisons, because he was a guard in a women's prison in Birmingham or somewhere in the north of England. And so he's writing women's prison poems, poetry that was set in the housing estates, which I guess is like the projects here, but in Britain it's called, I don't know, state housing or something. So amongst, people that were disadvantaged economically. And so he was using a subject matter, and prostitutes, and he was using subject matter that was not your typical poetry subject matters. And it sort of gave me freedom to, I thought, oh, I can do this, and he was a well thought of poet, yet he was writing poetry set in the real world. And that, I really liked that. I mean, I liked the poetry, but also I liked what he was doing. So they're just two that spring to mind: Rita Dove, Simon Armitage. I've said a British guy, I said an American woman. I have to be fair. I've got to put an Australian in there. And there's an Australian poet, she's dead now, Dorothy Porter is her name. And she wrote, wait for this, she wrote detective novels in verse, and the detective was a lesbian, like a butch lesbian, right? Detective noir, dyke poetry. You wouldn't think it would work, but it's amazing. It's amazing. It reads like there's strippers and all sorts of people like that but the hero of the book is this sort of butch dyke who's a private detective. That's what it is. And there's a series of them. It's poetry, and it's never been anything quite like it. She's quite well known, Dorothy Porter. Yeah, she got breast cancer, unfortunately, and died maybe in 2010 or something like that.
But thank you for the suggestions though. So we have Rita Dove, right?
Oh yes.
And the English
Simon Armitage.
Simon Armitage, and then the detective poet
Dorothy Porter.
Dorothy Porter, gotcha. I keep those names in the back of my mind. The Dorothy Porter one sounds pretty interesting.
She is. And Rita Dove's great. I think she's still alive, Rita Dove. She must be in her 80s. She's a sort of, well-respected literary figure in American poetry. Yeah. And Simon Armitage is definitely still alive in England. Dorothy Porter's passed away.
I also learned that you were a psychiatric nurse.
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
And you talked about how that influenced your perspective on the human condition.
Yes.
How have you integrated that in your poetry?
I have people in my poetry that are psychotic sometimes, and some that are maybe suicidal, and some poetry of psychopaths. I wrote a book of about Eileen Wuornos, the serial killer, in poetry. It was like a biography of Eileen Wuornos. She killed a whole lot of men in Florida, and I really tried to get in behind her motives in her mind with the poems. I tried to write them in her voice as I imagined it, and it really was deeply psychological. I hope people like it. I hope it worked.
Would you say that you were more interested in the darker aspects of the human condition?
Yeah, I guess so. Well, in my mind, I think I'm interested in the reality of the human condition, which is dark. But, I think that some people think that poetry is supposed to be elevated and talk about elevated things and about nature and the world. And I am a firm believer that good poetry can be rooted in the real world, Yeah.
That's because when I think of poetry, I think of flowery and whimsical, but it is refreshing to see a poem that is stark, I guess, and like grounded in reality, like you said.
Yeah,
it's interesting. But I read a poem of yours called 13 Years.
Oh.
And I thought it had something to tied with the human condition, because you talked about how someone is fading from your memories.
Yeah.
And I just thought that, being 22, that I'm at this point in my life where, some people are, leaving and some people are entering, and so many different changes. And I really like the last part of your poem where you thought that a memory was connected to this person, but then you weren't really sure.
Yeah.
Showing how, sometimes memories can like merge with each other, and then it's sort of a hazy recollection of your past.
Yeah. And then in that poem, I often put in really, really specific details, and it's because the details are so specific that they read like reality. And like I said, we stopped at that roadside caravan where they serve freshly caught crawfish, and we sat there and ate it on newspaper. And that is actually true. We did do that, me and the person in the poem. But like, I think that those details are really good in poetry. Really specific details like that.
Yeah, I agree, because when I read it, I felt like I was experiencing different moments over a different span of time.
Yeah.
So when you would describe these, like you said, the specific details, like eating on the roadside of the caravan, or being on the beach, it just like really quickly like flashed these images in my mind. And
and we were singing, and they were singing a Nirvana song.
Yes.
Yeah. And they were both singing as they drove along on the highway.
Yeah, and just made me like think about all these moments in my life that when I think about it, just like flashes, right? Because moments or memories are sort of, you can't recall it specifically, but it just sort of flashes in your mind.
Yeah, or a vibe. You
Hmm.
remember a vibe.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd been in a long relationship that had ended after 13 years, or maybe it was 11 years, but I thought 13 was a better number for the poem. I think I was together with that person for 11 years. And then maybe a couple of years later, I wrote that poem. I didn't write anything. I tend to write, some people, when they're experiencing the trauma of life, they write about it straight away or while they're in it. And for them, the writing is some kind of therapeutic. But I'm not like that. I wait a couple of years and I never write about things until afterwards when I've processed them quite a lot. And then I feel it's time. I was married. I had a husband here in the States and he went blind. He had an eye condition, but it got worse and he went blind. And that was a very defining time in my life. He was like really, it was a brutal thing for him to have to deal with that. And I also had to deal with it because I was his wife, but also his caregiver. And people kept saying, "Oh, why don't you write about that?" And I go, "Are you kidding? No, no way." And then maybe 3-4 years after, and he was starting to learn to live with that disability. And then I wrote about him going blind 4 years earlier. Or I just started to come out with a whole lot of poems about blindness and vision and loss of vision and stuff like that.
Would you say that waiting a bit before you write is um like I don't want to say strategy, that's not really the right word, but just the way you process and how to transform it into art? Because I know, like you said, a lot of people like to write it as they're experiencing whatever it is they're experiencing.
Yeah. Like the classic is people go through breakups and they're all emotional and then they're all
Hmm.
suicidal and they're all heartbroken and they write these long, like, or they're angry. They're
Yeah.
the worst ones. Oh, that bastard, what he did to me. And then they stand up and read these angry poems. And the thing is that they'll change and their thoughts and feelings will change over time.
Hmm.
And they might be embarrassed about reading that shit. I don't know.
Because hindsight is always 2020 on
Yeah.
many things. So yeah, that's interesting. I think it's very because as I said, a lot of people just write it as they're experiencing it. But I think that your strategy or your format of doing it is really interesting.
Yeah. It's not plan. It's just that I'm not ready,
Hmm.
but I'm just not ready. It's too fresh. And then one day I say to myself, I'm ready now. And I did that with that 13 years poem. I was ready to write about it like 2-3 years after the end of that relationship. And that was the poem I wrote. And the same with Dante going blind, I wasn't ready to write about it till 3-4 years after. But like say when Trump got in, all the poets in the Bay Area were all writing poems about Trump. And oh, isn't it terrible what's happening in American society? And at the moment they're all writing about abortion and Roe v. Wade and stuff like that. Like when major things happen in the world, all the poets suddenly, want to express themselves. They want to use their platform of poetry to make a statement or whatever. And I'm not that kind of poet. I'm not a highly political poet, and I'm not a contemporary issues poet. But it's big in the Bay Area. Like you'll go along to poetry reading, and several people will read poems about what's going on in the world at the moment. They're using their art to express their frustrations and thoughts and feelings and anger. There was a whole reading at the San Francisco Public Library about bodily autonomy, and I was invited to contribute and come along to that. And it was all, really in the wake of the abortion discussion and the Roe v. Wade thing and the Supreme Court. So all the poets wanted to say their piece.
That's actually all the questions I have for you.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to thank you, Natasha, for joining me today for this artist interview.
Oh, you're very
Um,
welcome.
Natasha is going to be performing at our Last Supper party. Again, that's November 5th. I'll also link her poet website in the newsletter. Thank you, Natasha. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Hayden. Nice to meet you. Will you be at the reading?
I would, yes, well,
I'll see you there.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.